Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, illustrated by A. E. Jackson, read by Michael Mosier. In a certain town of Persia there lived two brothers, one named Cassim, the other Ali Baba. Cassim had married a wife who brought him a good deal of property, and he had thus become one of the richest merchants in the town. Ali Baba, on the other hand, who had married for love and not for money, had to eke out his slender means by cutting wood in a neighboring forest, and carrying it about the town to sell, on 3 donkeys which were his only possessions. One day Ali Baba went to the forest, and had very nearly finished cutting as much wood as his donkeys could carry, when he perceived a thick cloud of dust advancing towards him. Ali Baba was a cautious man, so he climbed a tree which grew at the foot of a large rock, and hid himself among the branches, where he could see without being seen. Presently a band of horsemen appeared. Ali Baba counted 40, all well armed and mounted. Each of them tethered his horse and took off the saddlebags, which seemed extremely heavy. Then one, whom Ali Baba took to be the captain, came to the rock and exclaimed, "Open, Sesame!" Immediately a door opened in the rock, and they all passed through, the captain going last, and the door closed behind them. The robbers continued within the rock for some time, and Ali Baba was compelled to remain in the tree and to wait with patience for their departure, as he was afraid to leave his place of refuge, lest some of them should come out and discover him. At length the door opened, and the 40 robbers came out. The captain, contrary to his former proceeding, made his appearance first. After he had seen all his troops pass out before him, Ali Baba heard him exclaim, "Shut, Sesame!" and the door closed with a clang. Each man then returned to his horse, put on its bridle, fastened his bag, and mounted. When the captain saw that they were ready, he put himself at their head, and they departed on the road by which they had come. Ali Baba watched till he could see them no longer, and, in order to be more secure, delayed his descent for a considerable time. As he recollected the words the captain and of the robbers had used to open and shut the door, he had the curiosity to try if the same effect would be produced by his pronouncing them. He therefore made his way through the bushes to the door they concealed, and, on exclaiming, "Open, Sesame!" the door instantly flew wide open. Ali Baba, who had expected to find only a dark and gloomy cave, was astonished at seeing a large, spacious, well-lighted and vaulted room, dug out of the rock, and so high that he could not touch the roof with his hand. It received light from an opening at the top of the rock. He observed in it a large quantity of provisions, numerous bales of rich merchandise, a store of silk stuffs and brocades, and besides all this, great quantities of money, both silver and gold, partly piled up in heaps and partly stored in large leather bags, placed one on another. Ali Baba did not hesitate a moment, but entered the cave. As soon as he was in, the door closed behind him. But, as he knew the magic words by which to open it, this did not worry him. He paid no attention to the silver, but made directly for the gold coin, and particularly that portion which was in the bags. Having collected as much as he thought he could carry, he went in search of his donkeys, which he had left to look after themselves when he climbed the tree. They had strayed some way, but he brought them close to the door of the rock, and loaded them with the sacks of gold, which he then completely covered with faggots. When he had finished his task, he pronounced the words, "Shut, Sesame!" The door instantly closed, for, although it shut of itself every time when he went in, it remained open on his coming out till he commanded it to close. Ali Baba now took the road to the town, and when he got to his own house, drove his donkeys into the small courtyard belonging to it, and shut the gate with great care. He then carried the bags into his house and emptied them of their contents before his wife, who was first of all struck speechless, and then accused her husband of having turned robber. But her alarm was turned to joy when Ali Baba related his wonderful adventure. She tried to count the money, but Ali Baba, who was anxious to dig a hole and bury his treasure before any prying eye could see it, declared it would take too long. "Very well," she said, "dig your hole, and while you are digging it, I will go and borrow a measure from my sister-in-law, for I am determined to know how much money there is." So, having promised not to breathe a word about the gold, the wife of Ali Baba set off, and went to her brother-in-law, Cassim, who lived a short distance from her house. Cassim was from home, so she addressed herself to his wife, whom she begged to lend her a small measure. "With pleasure," said the sister-in-law. "Wait a moment, and I will bring it to you." She went to bring it, but knowing the poverty of Ali Baba, she was curious to know what sort of grain his wife wanted to measure. She bethought herself, therefore, of putting some tallow under the measure, in such a way that it could not be observed. The wife of Ali Baba returned home, and, placing the measure on the heap of gold, filled and emptied it till she had measured the whole. Her husband, having by this time dug the pit for its reception, she informed him how many measures there were, and both rejoiced at the greatness of the treasure. While Ali Baba was burying the gold, his wife carried back the measure to her sister-in-law, without observing that a piece of gold had stuck to the bottom. "Here, sister," she said, "you see I have not kept your measure long. I am much obliged to you for lending it to me." So soon as the wife of Ali Baba had gone, Cassim's wife examined the bottom of the measure, and was astonished to see a piece of gold sticking to it. "What!" she exclaimed. "Has Ali Baba such an abundance of gold that he measures instead of counting it? If so, how in the world did he come by it?" Her husband, Cassim, was from home, but the moment he entered the house, his wife flew to him and said, "Cassim, you think you are rich, but Ali Baba has infinitely more wealth. He does not count his money as you do. He measures it." Cassim demanded an explanation, and his wife showed him the piece of money she had found sticking to the bottom of the measure. Far from feeling any pleasure at his brother's good fortune, Cassim felt extremely jealous. The next morning, he went to Ali Baba with the intention of solving the mystery. "O Ali Baba," said he, "you are very reserved in your affairs. You pretend to be poor, and yet you have so much money that you must measure it." "O my brother," replied Ali Baba, "I do not understand. Pray, explain yourself." "Do not pretend ignorance," answered Cassim, and showing Ali Baba the piece of gold his wife had given him, he continued, "How many pieces have you like this that my wife found sticking to the bottom of the measure, which your wife borrowed from her yesterday?" When Ali Baba found that, thanks to his wife, his sudden wealth was a secret no longer, he frankly owned by what chance he had found it, the retreat of the thieves, and he offered, if Cassim would agree to keep the secret, to share the treasure with him. "This I certainly expect you will do," replied Cassim, in a haughty tone, and he added, "But I demand to know also the precise spot where this treasure lies concealed, and the signs which may enable me to visit the place myself. If you refuse this information, I will go and inform the police, and you will not only be unable to help yourself to any more money, but you will lose what you have already taken, whereas I shall receive my portion for having informed against you." Actuated more by natural goodness of heart than by fear of his brother's threats, Ali Baba gave the information demanded, and even told Cassim the words he must pronounce both on entering the cave and on quitting it. Next morning, before break of day, Cassim, full of the hope of possessing himself of the entire treasure, set off with 10 mules furnished with large hampers, which he proposed to fill. He took the road Ali Baba had pointed out, arrived at the rock, and saw the tree, which, from the description, he knew to be the one that had concealed his brother. He soon discovered the door, and pronounced the mystic words, "Open, Sesame!" The door opened, he entered, and it immediately closed behind him. On examining the cave, he found even more wealth than the description of Ali Baba had led him to expect. Having feasted his eyes, he started to collect as much treasure as his 10 mules could carry. But when dragging a number of sacks behind him, he came to the door, he found, to his great consternation, that he had forgotten the right words. "Open, barley," he said, but the door did not budge an inch. He then named the various other kinds of grain, all but the right one, but the door did not move. At this, fear took possession of his mind. The more he endeavored to recollect the word sesame, the more he failed. He threw to the ground the sacks he had collected, and paced backward and forward in a perfect frenzy of terror. The riches which surrounded him had no longer any charms for his imagination. Towards noon, the robbers returned to their cave, and when they saw the mules belonging to Cassim standing about the rock, laden with hampers, they were greatly surprised. They all, including the captain, alighted, and, drawing their sabers, went towards the door and pronounced the magic words, which caused it to open. Cassim, who from inside the cave had heard the noise of horses trampling, felt sure the robbers had arrived, and that his death was certain. Resolved, however, to make one effort to escape, he posted himself near the door, ready to run out as soon as it should open. The word sesame, which he had in vain endeavored to recall, was scarcely pronounced when the portal opened, and he rushed out with such violence that he threw the captain to the ground. He could not, however, avoid the other thieves, who cut him to pieces on the spot. On entering the cave, the robbers at once discovered sacks of gold which Cassim had left near the entrance, and replaced them. But they did not notice the absence of those taken by Ali Baba. They were, however, much puzzled as to the means by which Cassim had managed to enter the cave, and, in order to scare off anyone else who might dare to enter, they cut the body of the unfortunate Cassim into quarters and placed them near the door. Then they mounted their horses and set off to commit more robberies. The wife of Cassim, in the meantime, began to feel very uneasy as night approached, and her husband did not return. She went, in the utmost alarm, to Ali Baba, and said, "O brother, I believe you are well aware that my husband went to the forest, and for what purpose? He has not yet come back, and I fear some accident may have befallen him." Ali Baba had suspected his brother's intention after the conversation he had held with him. However, he replied that she need not feel any uneasiness, as Cassim most probably thought it wiser not to return until dark. Thus he soothed her alarm so that she returned to her house, and waited patiently till midnight. But after that hour her fears returned with twofold strength. She spent the night in watching and weeping, and at break of day ran to Ali Baba and entreated him to go and seek for Cassim. After advising the disconsolate wife to restrain her grief, Ali Baba immediately set off with his 3 donkeys to the forest. As he grew near the rocks, he was astonished to observe that blood had been shed near the door, and, not having met on his way either his brother or the 10 mules, he looked on this as an unfavorable sign. He reached the rock, and on his pronouncing the words, the door opened and he entered, to be struck with horror by the discovery of the body of his brother cut into 4 quarters. Without losing time in bewailing his fate, he picked up the remains, which he placed on one of his donkeys and covered it with sticks. The other 2 donkeys he quickly loaded with sacks of gold, covering them with more sticks. Then, commanding the door to close, he took the road to the city, taking care to wait at the entrance of the forest until dark, that he might return without being observed. When he got home, he left the 2 donkeys that were laden with gold in the care of his wife, and, after telling her in a few words what had happened to Cassim, he led the 3rd donkey away to his sister-in-law. Ali Baba knocked at the door, which was opened to him by a female slave named Morgiana. This Morgiana was very sharp and clever, and Ali Baba knew her abilities well. He broke the bad news to her, and then bade her summon her mistress, who came to him in great anxiety. Ali Baba first made her promise to listen calmly to the story he had to tell, and then related all that had happened. "Sister," added he, "here is a great and sudden affliction for you, but you must control your grief, and do your crying later, for we must contrive to bury my brother as though he had died a natural death. I have an idea which, I think, with the help of Morgiana, can be carried out." At this, the widow of Cassim allowed her sobs to subside, for she was not without common sense, and listened while Ali Baba coached Morgiana in the part she was to play. Accordingly, Morgiana was as sharp as a needle, assumed a woeful expression, and went to the shop of the nearest apothecary, where she asked for a particular medicine which was supposed to cure the most serious ailments. On the following day, Morgiana again went to the apothecary and, with tears in her eyes, inquired for an essence which it was customary only to administer when the patient was reduced to the last extremity, and when no other remedy had been left untried. "Alas!" cried she, as she received it from the hands of the apothecary, "I fear this remedy will be of no more use than the other, and I shall lose my beloved master." Moreover, as Ali Baba and his wife were seen going to and from the house of Cassim in the course of the day with very long faces, no one was surprised when, towards evening, the piercing cries of the widow and Morgiana announced the death of Cassim. At a very early hour next morning, Morgiana, knowing that an old cobbler who lived some distance off was one of the first to open his shop, went out to visit him. Coming up to him, she wished him good day and put a piece of gold in his hand. Baba Mustapha, a man well known throughout the city, was naturally of a gay turn of mind, and had always something laughable to say. He examined the piece of money, and seeing that it was gold, said, "This is good wage. What is to be done? I am ready to do your bidding." "Baba Mustapha," said Morgiana to him, "take all your materials for sewing, and come with me. But I insist on this condition, that you let me put a bandage over your eyes when we have got to a certain place." At these words, Baba Mustapha began to make objections. "Oh ho!" said he, "you want me to do something against my conscience or my honor?" But Morgiana interrupted him by putting another piece of gold in his hand. "Allah forbid," she said, "that I should require you to do anything that would hurt your conscience or stain your honor. Only come with me and fear nothing." Baba Mustapha suffered himself to be led by Morgiana, who bound a handkerchief over his eyes and brought him to Cassim's house. Nor did she remove the bandage until he was in the chamber where the remains were placed. When taking off the covering, she said, "Baba Mustapha, I have brought you hither that you may sew these 4 quarters together. Lose no time, and when you have done, I will give you another piece of gold." When Baba Mustapha had finished his gruesome task, Morgiana bound his eyes again, and after giving him the 3rd piece of money, according to promise, and earnestly exhorting him to keep her secret, she conducted him to the place where she had first put on the handkerchief. Here she took the bandage from his eyes and left him to return to his house, watching him, however, until he was out of sight, lest he should have the curiosity to return and notice her movements. Then the body of the unfortunate Cassim was washed, perfumed, wrapped in an elegant shroud, and buried with due ceremony. The widow remained at home to lament and weep with the women of the neighborhood, who, according to custom, had repaired to her house during the ceremony. But Morgiana followed the coffin, weeping and tearing her hair. Ali Baba had a son who had served his apprenticeship with a merchant of good repute. He now placed the young man in charge of the shop which had belonged to Cassim, while he himself removed with his belongings to his late brother's house, which was larger and more commodious than his own. Leaving Ali Baba to enjoy his good fortune, we will now return to the 40 thieves. On going back to the cave, they were amazed and alarmed to find the body of Cassim gone, together with a large portion of their treasure. "We are discovered," said the captain, "and if we are not careful, shall lose all the riches we have amassed with so much trouble and fatigue. All we know is that the thief whom we surprised when he was going to make his escape knew the secret of opening the door. But evidently he was not the only one. Another must have the same knowledge, and, as we have no reason to suppose that more than 2 people are acquainted with the secret, having destroyed one, we must not suffer the other to escape. What say you?" The other 39 robbers agreed that it would be advisable to give up every other enterprise and occupy themselves solely with this affair until they had succeeded. "Then," resumed the captain, "the first thing to be done is that one of you who is bold, courageous, and cunning should go to the city unarmed and in the dress of a traveler, and employ all his art to discover if the singular death we inflicted on the culprit we destroyed is being talked about. Then he must find out who this man was and where he lived. But, in order to prevent his bringing us a false report, which might occasion our total ruin, I propose that the one selected to perform the task shall consent to the penalty of death in case of failure." Without waiting till his companion should speak, one of the robbers said, "I agree to those terms, and if I should fail, you will, at least, remember that I displayed both courage and readiness in my offer to serve the troop." Amid the commendations of the captain and his companions, the robber disguised himself in such a way that no one could have suspected him of being what he was. He set off at night, and entering the city just as day was dawning, went towards the public bazaar, where he saw only one shop open, and that the shop of Baba Mustapha. The merry cobbler was seated on his stool, ready to begin work. The robber went up to him and wished him a good morning, saying, "My good man, you rise betimes to your work. How is it possible that an old man like you can see clearly at this early hour? Even if it were broad day, I doubt whether your eyes are good enough to see the stitches you make." "Whoever you are," replied Baba Mustapha, "you do not know much about me. Old as I am, I have excellent eyes, and you would have owned as much had you known that not long since I sewed up a dead body as neatly as possible in a place where there was not more light than we have here." The robber was greatly elated at so soon discovering this important clue. "A dead body?" replied he with feigned astonishment. To induce the other to proceed, "Why should you want to sew up a dead body? I suppose you mean that you sewed the shroud in which he was buried." "No, no," said Baba Mustapha, "nothing of the kind. But, anyhow, it is no business of yours." Upon this, the robber produced a piece of gold, and putting it into Baba Mustapha's hand, said, "Keep your temper and your secret too, if you like. All the same, if you would care to earn this piece of money, you can do so by showing me the house where you perform this extraordinary piece of needlework." "Should I feel inclined to grant your request," replied Baba Mustapha, holding the piece of money in his hand as if ready to return it, "I assure you I could not do it, for the simple reason that I was blindfolded both coming and going." "But at least," resumed the robber, "you must have some idea of the way you went after your eyes were bound. Pray come with me. I will put a bandage over your eyes at the place where you were blindfolded, and we will walk together along the same streets and follow the same turnings, which you will probably recollect to have taken. And, as all labor deserves a reward, here is another piece of gold." 2 pieces of gold were a great temptation to Baba Mustapha. "Well, well," he said, "I will do my best." He then conducted the robber to the spot where Morgiana had put the bandage over his eyes. "This is the place," said he, "where my eyes were bound, and then my face was turned in this direction." The robber, who had his handkerchief ready, tied it over the old man's eyes, and walked by his side, partly leading him and partly led by him, till Baba Mustapha stopped. "I think," said he, "I did not go farther than this." He was, in fact, exactly before the house which had once belonged to Cassim, and where Ali Baba now resided. Before taking the bandage from the cobbler's eyes, the robber quickly made a mark on the door with some chalk he had bought for the purpose. And, when he had taken the handkerchief off, he asked Baba Mustapha if he knew to whom the house belonged. The cobbler replied that he did not live in that quarter of the town, and therefore could not tell. Whereupon the robber thanked him, and, when he had seen the cobbler set out for his shop, took the road to the forest, where he felt sure his tidings would be welcome. Soon after the robber and Baba Mustapha had separated, Morgiana had occasion to go out on some errand, and when she returned she observed the mark which the robber had made on the door of the house. "What can this mean?" thought she. "Has anyone a spite against my master? Or has it been made only for diversion? Anyhow, I will take precautions." She therefore procured a piece of chalk, and as several of the doors on each side of her master's house were of the same appearance, she marked them in the same manner. In the meantime the thief made the best of his way back to the forest, where he rejoined his companions and related the success of his journey. After some discussion, it was arranged that the spy should return to the city accompanied by the captain and make further investigations. But when the two arrived at the house where Ali Baba lived, they were confronted by a whole row of doors with chalk marks, though the robber declared with an oath that he had marked but one. The captain was much annoyed, but there was nothing for it but to return to the forest, where the unlucky robber had his head cut off as the penalty of his failure. In spite of this, another robber, who flattered himself with hopes of better success, requested to be allowed to see what he could do. Permission being granted, he went to the city, bribed Baba Mustapha with more gold, and the cobbler, with his eyes bound, went through the same performance and led him to the house of Ali Baba. The thief marked the door with red chalk in a place where it would be less noticed, thinking this would be a surer method of distinguishing it. But a short time afterward, Morgiana went out, as on the preceding day, and on her return the red mark did not escape her sharp eyes. She immediately made a similar mark on all the neighboring doors. When he returned to his companions in the forest, the thief boasted of the precautions he had taken to distinguish the house of Ali Baba, to which he offered to lead the captain without fail. But the result was the same. A whole row of front doors marked with red chalk met the captain's irritated eye, and the second robber lost his head. This reduced the 40 thieves to 38, and the captain determined to undertake the task himself. He therefore went to the city, and, with the assistance of Baba Mustapha, found the house of Ali Baba. But, having no faith in chalk marks, he imprinted the place thoroughly on his memory, looking at it so attentively that he was certain he could not mistake it. He then returned to the forest, and when he had reached the cave, said, "Comrades, I now know the certainty the house of the culprit who is to experience our revenge, and I have planned a first-rate way of dealing with him." He then charged them to divide into small parties, and go into the neighboring towns and villages, and there buy 19 mules and 38 large leathern jars for carrying oil, one of which jars must be full, and all the others empty. In the course of 2 or 3 days, the thieves, having completed their purchases to the captain's satisfaction, he made one of the men, thoroughly armed, enter each jar. He then closed the jars, so that they appeared to be full of oil, leaving, however, a sufficient aperture to admit air for the men to breathe. And, the better to carry out the deception, he rubbed the outside of each jar with oil. Thus prepared, the mules were laden with 37 robbers, each concealed in a jar, and with the jar that was filled with oil. Then the captain, disguised as an oil merchant, took the road to the city, where the whole procession arrived about an hour after sunset. The captain went straight to the house of Ali Baba, intending to knock and request shelter for the night for himself and his mules. He was, however, spared the trouble of knocking, for he found Ali Baba at the door, enjoying the fresh air after supper. He stopped his mules, and addressing himself to Ali Baba, said, "My good friend, I have brought the oil which you see here from a great distance to sell tomorrow in the market, and at this late hour I do not know where to obtain shelter for the night. If it would not occasion you much inconvenience, do me the favor to take me in, and I shall be greatly obliged." Although in the forest Ali Baba had seen the man who now spoke to him, and had even heard his voice, he did not recognize him in his disguise. "You are welcome," he said, and immediately made room for the visitor and his mules to enter. A stable and fodder were made ready for the mules, after which Ali Baba went into the kitchen to desire Morgiana to get supper quickly for a guest who had just arrived, and also to prepare him a chamber and a bed. The captain of the robbers endeavored to excuse himself from accepting the bed, alleging that he was loath to be troublesome, but in reality that he might have an opportunity of executing his design with more ease. And it was not until Ali Baba had used the most urgent persuasions that he yielded. Ali Baba remained with his guest until he saw that he had all he required. Then he wished him good night, and said, "You are at liberty to do as you please. You have only to ask for whatever you want. All I have is at your service." The captain of the robbers thanked him profusely. Then, while Ali Baba went into the kitchen to speak to Morgiana, he stole away to the stable under the pretext of going to see after his mules. Ali Baba, having again enjoined Morgiana to be attentive to his guest, added, "Tomorrow, before daybreak, I shall go to the bath. Take care that my bathing linen is ready, and give it to Abdallah." This was the name of his male slave. "And make me some good broth to take when I return." After giving these orders, he went to bed. The captain of the robbers then found his way to the stable, and gave his men orders what to do. Beginning at the first jar, and going through the whole number, he said to the man in each, "When I throw some stones from the room where I am to be lodged tonight, do not fail to rip open the jar with the knife you are furnished with, and come out. I shall be with you immediately afterwards." He then returned and was conducted by Morgiana to the chamber she had prepared for him. Not to create suspicion, he put out the light a short time after, and lay down in his clothes to be ready to rise as soon as he considered it safe to do so. Morgiana did not forget Ali Baba's orders. She prepared her master's linen for the bath, and gave it to Abdallah. Then she put the pot on the fire to make the broth, but while she was skimming it, the lamp went out. There was no more oil in the house, and she had not a candle, so she knew not what to do. "What are you worrying about?" said Abdallah. "All you have to do is to go and take some oil out of one of the big jars in the stable." Morgiana thanked Abdallah for the hint, and, while he returned to bed, she took her own oil jar and went to the stable. As she drew near to the jar that stood first in the row, the thief who was concealed within said in a low voice, "Is it time?" Any slave but Morgiana would, in the surprise of finding a man in the jar instead of the oil she expected, have jumped and screamed. But Morgiana at once realized the extreme danger in which Ali Baba and his family, as well as herself, were placed. Consequently, she assumed the manner of the captain and answered, "Not yet, but presently." She then went on to all the vessels in succession, making the same answer to the same question, till she came to the last jar, which was full of oil. Morgiana by this means discovered that her master had afforded shelter to 38 robbers, including the pretended merchant who was their captain. She quickly filled her own vessel from the last jar, and returned to the kitchen. Then, having lighted her lamp, she took a very large kettle, and went again to the stable to fill it with oil from the jar. This kettle she immediately put upon the fire, for she had a plan for the preservation of the family, which required the utmost dispatch. As soon as the oil boiled, she took the great kettle, and, returning to the stable, poured into each jar, from the first to the last, sufficient boiling oil to stifle and destroy the robber within. When Morgiana had performed this brave act, she returned to the kitchen, blew out her lamp, and waited to see what would happen. She had scarcely waited a quarter of an hour when the captain of the robbers awoke. He got up, opened the window, and gave the signal agreed upon. He listened, but heard nothing. After a while, overcome by uneasiness, he stole from his chamber and made his way to the stable. On approaching the first jar, he smelt a strong scent of hot oil. He proceeded to the next jar, and to all in succession, and discovered that all his men had shared the same fate. Therefore, his plan to revenge himself by the destruction of Ali Baba and all his household had failed, and the sooner he made his own escape, the better. When Morgiana perceived that the captain of the thieves did not return, she rightly concluded that he had decamped through the garden. Consequently, she retired to rest, feeling very pleased with herself. When Ali Baba returned from the bath early next morning, he was met at the door by Morgiana, who, with an air of mystery, led him to the stable, and, pointing to one of the oil jars, begged him to look inside. He did as she desired, and, perceiving a man in the jar, uttered a cry of surprise. "Morgiana!" he exclaimed, "what does this mean?" "Look first in all the other jars," she replied. When Ali Baba had done so, and found a dead robber in each, Morgiana told him the events of the preceding night, how she had discovered and killed the 37 thieves, and of the escape of the captain of the band. She also informed him of the mysterious chalk marks on the door, and of the manner in which she had made them useless. When she had finished her tale, Ali Baba, with deep emotion, observed, "You are no longer my slave, but my benefactress. I give you your liberty from this moment, and will soon reward you in a more ample manner. I am convinced that the captain of the robbers laid this snare for me, and, through your means, Allah has delivered me. What we have now to do is to use the utmost dispatch in burying the bodies, which we must do with secrecy, and for this purpose I will instantly go to work with Abdallah." Ali Baba's garden was of considerable size, and ended in a clump of large trees. He went without delay with his slave to dig under these trees a ditch, or grave, of sufficient size to contain the bodies. They then took the bodies out of the jars and placed them in the grave, after which Ali Baba carefully concealed the oil jars. As for the mules, he sent them to the market at different times, and disposed of them by means of his slave. Meanwhile, the captain of the 40 thieves had returned to the forest in a condition of rage and despair, which gradually gave way to a determination to make a final effort to avenge himself upon Ali Baba, whom he held responsible for the destruction of the entire band. Therefore, the very next day, having assumed a fresh disguise, he repaired to the city, where he took a lodging at an inn. As he supposed that the events which had happened in the house of Ali Baba would have become generally known, he asked the host if there were any news stirring, in reply to which the host talked on a variety of subjects, but never mentioned the one the captain had nearest at heart. By this the latter concluded that the reason Ali Baba kept the transaction secret was that he did not wish to divulge the fact of his having access to so immense a treasure. To carry out his design, the captain provided himself with a horse, which he made use of to convey to his lodgings several kinds of rich stuffs and fine linens, bringing them from the cave in the forest at various times. In order to dispose of this merchandise, he sought for a shop. Having found one that suited him, he hired it, stocked it with his goods, and established himself in it. The shop, as it happened, was exactly opposite the one that had belonged to Cassim, and was now occupied by the son of Ali Baba. The captain of the robbers, who now assumed the name Khoji Husan, took an early opportunity of getting on friendly terms with his neighbors. The son of Ali Baba, being young and of a pleasing address, and the captain having more frequent occasion to converse with him than with the others, the two men soon formed an intimacy. This apparent friendship quickly increased when the captain discovered that the young man was the son of his enemy, Ali Baba. The son of Ali Baba did not care to receive favors and hospitality from his new friend without making some return. On mentioning this to his father, Ali Baba willingly undertook to provide an entertainment. "My son," said he, "tomorrow is Friday, when most of the merchants close their shops. I will give orders to Morgiana to prepare a supper, to which you shall invite your friend, Khoji Husan." Though the late captain of the 40 Thieves by this means attained his desire in gaining admission to the house of his enemy, he was most anxious not to take a meal beneath his roof. Therefore, though he entered the house and received a hearty welcome from Ali Baba, he endeavored to leave before supper, giving as a reason his dislike to eat of any dish that contained salt. But Ali Baba hospitably refused to accept any excuse. "If that is your only reason," he said, "it need not deprive me of the honor of your company. In the first place, the bread which is eaten in my house does not contain salt. And as for the meat and other dishes, I promise you there shall be none in those which are placed before you. I will now go to give orders to that effect." Ali Baba went to the kitchen and desired Morgiana not to put any salt to the meat she was going to serve for supper. He also told her to prepare, without any salt, 2 or 3 other dishes he had ordered. Morgiana could not refrain from expressing some surprise at this new order. "Who," said she, "is this man who eats no salt with his meat? Your supper will be spoiled if I have to suit his whims." "Do not be angry," replied Ali Baba. "He is an honest man. Do as I desire you." Morgiana obeyed, though much against her will. She felt a great curiosity to see this man who did not eat salt. So when she had finished her preparations, and Abdallah had prepared the table, she helped to carry in the dishes. On looking at Khoji Husan, she knew him at once, notwithstanding his disguise, as the captain of the robbers, and she also perceived that he had a dagger concealed under his garment. "I am not surprised," said she to herself, "that this villain will not eat salt with my master. He is his bitterest enemy, and means to murder him. But I will prevent him." When Morgiana had finished bringing in his dishes, and assisting Abdallah to wait upon the company, she quitted the room in order to carry out a purpose she had in her mind, leaving Ali Baba, his son, and their guest to enjoy their wine and dessert. Khoji Husan, or rather the former captain of the 40 Thieves, now thought he had a favorable opportunity. "I will make them both drunk," thought he, "and then the son will be unable to prevent my plunging my dagger in the heart of his father, and I shall escape by way of the garden, as I did before, while the cook and the other slave are at their supper, or, perhaps, asleep in the kitchen. But, instead of going to supper, Morgiana dressed herself like a dancing girl and stuck a dagger in her girdle. Then she said to Abdallah, "Take your tambourine, and let us go and entertain our master's guest, and the friend of his son, by the music and dance we sometimes practice together." Abdallah took his tambourine and accompanied Morgiana to the supper chamber. She then begged her master to allow her to do something to entertain his guest. "A capital idea," observed Ali Baba approvingly. And though Koji Husan would gladly have dispensed with this diversion, he, too, pretended to be highly pleased. So Abdallah played the tambourine with all the skill he could command, and Morgiana danced. After she had performed several dances with great grace and agility, Morgiana drew out the dagger and began to flourish it as though this were a part of the performance, sometimes pretending to stab the air, and sometimes herself. At length, apparently out of breath, she took the tambourine from Abdallah with her left hand, and, holding the dagger in her right, presented the tambourine with the hollow part upwards to Ali Baba, in imitation of the professional dancers, who were accustomed in this way to appeal to the liberality of spectators. Ali Baba threw a piece of gold into the tambourine. Morgiana then presented it to his son, who followed his father's example. Chogia Hussein had already taken a piece of money from his purse when Morgiana, with a courage and promptness equal to the resolution she had formed, plunged the dagger in his heart. Ali Baba and his son, terrified at this action, uttered a loud cry. "Wretch!" exclaimed Ali Baba, "what hast thou done? Thou hast ruined me and my family forever." "What have I done?" replied Morgiana, "is not for your ruin, but for your safety." Then, opening Chogia Husan's robe to show Ali Baba the dagger which was concealed under it, she continued, "Behold, the cruel enemy you had to deal with. Look at his face attentively, and you will recognize the pretended oil merchant and the captain of the 40 robbers. Do you not recollect that he refused to eat salt with you? From the moment you told me of this, I suspected his design. Are you not convinced that my suspicions were well founded?" Ali Baba, who now understood the fresh obligation he owed to Morgiana for having thus preserved his life a second time, kissed her on both cheeks, and said, "Morgiana, I gave you your freedom, and, at the same time, promised to show you stronger proofs of my gratitude at some future period. This period has now arrived. I present you to my son as his wife." Then, addressing his son, he continued, "I believe you to be too dutiful a son to take it amiss if I bestow Morgiana upon you without previously consulting your inclinations. Your obligation to her is not less than mine." Far from showing any discontent, Ali Baba's son replied that he willingly consented to the marriage, not only to prove his ready obedience to his father's wishes, but because his own inclination prompted him to do so. Then they resolved to bury the captain of the robbers by the side of his former companions, and this duty was performed with such secrecy that the circumstance was not known till many years had passed. A few days after the burial, Ali Baba caused the nuptials of his son and Morgiana to be celebrated. He gave a sumptuous feast to which he invited all his friends and neighbors. And if the guest felt any surprise at the match, they took care not to show it. Ali Baba, who had not revisited the cave since he had brought away the body of his brother Cassim, lest he should meet with any of the thieves and be slain by them, still refrained from going thither even after the death of the 37 robbers and their captain, as he was ignorant of the fate of the other two, and supposed them to be still alive. At the expiration of a year, however, finding that no attempt had been made to disturb his quiet, he had the curiosity to make a journey to the cave. He mounted his horse, and when he approached the cave, seeing no traces of either men or horses, he thought this a favorable omen. He dismounted, and fastening his horse, went up to the door and repeated the words, "Open, Sesame." The door opened and he entered. The state in which everything appeared in the cave led him to judge that no one had been in it from the time when the pretended Chogia Husan had opened his shop in the city, and therefore he concluded that the whole troop of robbers was totally dispersed or exterminated, that he himself was now the only person in the world who was acquainted with the secret of entering the cave, and that consequently the immense treasure it contained was entirely at his disposal. He had provided himself with a bag, and he filled it with as much gold as his horse could carry, with which he returned to the city. So Ali Baba and his son, whom he took to the cave and taught the secret of entering, lived happily ever after, and their descendants, who were also entrusted with the secret, lived in great splendor, enjoying their riches with moderation, and were honored with the greatest offices of the city.